Hi everyone, it's Miss Brenner. I'm here to go over our science fiction short story project directions. So you'll be creating your own version of a short story that can either be within the genre of horror, science fiction technology, or high fantasy. And we'll talk a little bit more about those genres in just a moment. As far as the points for this project, the outline slides are going to be worth 25 points, and then the creative short story final draft is going to be worth 20 points, which makes a total of 45 points. As far as your short story outline slides, students will be constructing a rough draft of their short story using a slide format that is focused on the Stephen King method of creating the what-if scenario. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the contents of those slides. They should contain a title slide that tells me the title of your short story that you are preparing to write, and you as the author. You need to then have a slide that addresses the what-if scenario. So the what-if scenario is pretty much the idea that in order to create a story, we should come up with what if something happened. So for Stephen King's novel It, the what-if scenario is what would happen if we put a killer clown that is semi-demonic in a small town and dropped in a group of small children as characters. That's pretty much the what-if scenario. And therefore we're going to outline the basic premise of the cause for the story. This gives us a basic idea as to why we are writing the story, what purpose the plot serves. Characters are then going to be in their own section, so the next section should be about your characters that you're going to drop into your what-if scenario. So these characters are contained in their own section of slides. Characters are given personality traits that will either support or hinder the other characters. Characters are fleshed out to give the reader a sense of investment in the characters. So characters should have positive and negative characteristics. Most importantly, they need to have negative characteristics in order to feel like a regular human being. When we think of characters like Hercules, he has very few flaws, and that makes him feel unrelatable as a real person. And that's okay for like a Disney character. They don't need to be overly complicated. But when it comes to a lot of short stories, especially as you have read through the ones in our class, you might notice that a lot of times our characters have a lot of negative features because they are human. So please keep that in mind when you are creating your characters. It's okay to have a villain and it's okay to have a hero, but even your hero should have a flaw. So characters are in their own section, and then we move on to the setting section. So it is contained in its own section of the slides. Setting is described and given a specific location. So if you are having it take place in the real world, you should try and pick a location like through Google Maps or something of that nature in order to pin down what you want your scenery to look like and how the setting is going to impact your plot. So a lot of Stephen King stories take place in Maine, and that's because that's where he grew up. So it's easy for him to say and visualize, oh, I want it to happen at the high school, so this is what my high school kind of looked like, and then kind of build the story around those events. So if you struggle coming up with a setting, I do recommend picking a place that you feel comfortable with, whether that is Lancaster County or maybe somewhere else that you go on vacation to quite often. So that way you can use the surroundings there and real places that you've gone to help build your setting. Include pictures to support your vision of the setting. So if you were envisioning a specific season, or if you're envisioning a specific kind of weather, maybe it's a dark and dreary day in September, try to pick pictures that help to represent that. Try to pick images that help to support the setting itself, so that way as you are writing, it helps to build that image in your mind. So that way your characters play into that environment. Your next set of slides in this project is going to be about foreshadowing. So that is contained, and when I say contained, I mean that you have like a title slide dividing these into sections. So foreshadowing is contained in its own section of the slides. You're going to use elements of plot to organize the tactics foreshadowing you intend to use to push the plot. So let's talk rising actions. Rising actions are going to be things that show your character's weaknesses. They have conflicts. They have complications. They are experiencing and gaining a footing in the story itself. So your rising actions should have a large amount of foreshadowing. This is where the most foreshadowing is going to take place because you are laying the groundwork. You must have complications in order to have a narrative. So please realize that complications are smaller issues that your characters are dealing with individually. So for Graveyard Shift, maybe think about how Hall is unhappy with his job. He felt like he could have done more with his life. He's a drifter. He's been traveling a lot. He doesn't make a lot of money, and he's just not completely comfortable in his work that he does. That is a complication. While the major conflict is between Warwick and Hall, Warwick always trying to have this authority over Hall. That is the major conflict. So you can have multiple complications. Maybe several of your characters don't get along for different reasons. Maybe you have a group of teenagers and secretly behind their backs, there's a relationship going on that isn't healthy, and the other characters don't know that, and it creates a major conflict by the end of the story. But there should be complications in order to push your plot forward. You would then finally have your climax, which is the highest point in your story, where things either come crumbling down or things like the problem get resolved. So remember to use your different elements of foreshadowing in that section. So think aha moments, tough questions, memory moments, all the ones that we have already practiced. You're going to try and think how you would try and foreshadow what's going to be resolved in the end of the story. As far as the video that we looked at, mimicking foreshadowing, you want to foreshadow events, look back on them throughout the story to keep giving the audience that hint, and then follow through the delivery method. You want to make sure that the climax is clear for the audience. As far as resolution, this should also be contained in its own section. So climax and resolution. Discuss the deeper meaning of the story in relationship to minimum two literary lenses. So this doesn't always have to be overly complicated. It doesn't have to be a gender lens story about female empowerment. As we saw with Graveyard Shift, it could be quite the opposite. It could be about how people are extremely detrimental to each other and have nothing to do with specific genders, but more masculine and feminine characteristics. It could have to do with psychological and maybe coming out at a healthier mindset on the other side. It doesn't have to be a poster message about mental health. It could be, the reality of how sometimes people make really bad choices and those have consequences. So you need to make sure that there is some form of deeper meaning in your story, and it very naturally will probably happen as you start setting your story up. You need to discuss the climax of the story and if it is effective in delivering your message to the audience. So every story has a message. You want to make sure that the message that you send to your audience is clear. Discuss the resolution and what emotions you want to evoke in the audience. Every story should evoke some kind of emotion, whether it is to make the audience laugh or laugh at themselves. It could be some form of discomfort, which a lot of Stephen King stories are about causing discomfort. It could even be just like an emotional journey for your audience as a whole. It might be having them reflect on how difficult and alone they feel, particularly during these times that are so difficult for our country. It could be something much like that, considering Graveyard Shift also focuses on being greatly alone, even though all the men are in this together. So, you are crafting your own short story through this slide setup, so that way we can discuss and start forming what you want to do for your short story. That is going to be due on the fall, so you'll have a week to complete the slide set. Please check online in the discussion. I list when the due date is for your slide set and when the due date is for your final story. I will also go over that in the agenda for this week, so please make sure that you listen to when these assignments are due. The creative short story part. So this is going to be your actual written story. Students will construct their choice of a short story within the genre of either fantasy, horror, and I did say science fiction technology, so that is also an option. This should be a brief plot that develops within the limit of 10 to 15 pages, typed Times New Roman font, 12-point font, double-spaced with MLA heading. I will have an example of what MLA heading looks like, but at this point, I feel like you should be pretty comfortable with MLA heading. Alright, so requirements. Times New Roman, 12-point font, double-spaced with MLA heading. Already said that, but that is a requirement. It needs to have a title for your short story. It needs to be written in paragraph form. So you can include dialogue, that is perfectly fine, and you would set up dialogue in an MLA format as well, and I will include an example of that on Schoology. Follows typical plot diagram, so once again, exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution, just like was discussed in the slides. Contains a protagonist and an antagonist, can take different forms, and support characters. So you need to have a variety of characters. Usually whoever is the protagonist is being the victim of whatever kind of traumatic situation is going on by the antagonist. Characters speak in dialogue, but this is not the major proponent of the story's length. So as said before, you can have dialogue. Dialogue is a great method in order to make sure that the point is put across as far as your characters' personalities and their intentions. But please do not make dialogue the majority length of your story, because typically when people have dialogue in their story, they have a character speak, then they have a new line, so you're going to hit enter. So it does add length to your story, but please do not make them having dialogue 90% of your story. Alright, meets the expectation of either fantasy or horror as a genre. Contains elements of foreshadowing as indicated in the slides, and reflects a deeper meaning through literary lens, interpretation, and characterization. Let's talk a little bit about the genres. So fantasy is a genre of speculative fiction set in a fictional universe, often inspired by real-world myth and folklore. It contains otherworldly elements that are characteristics expected within the fantasy genre. So this would be like the fairy handbag that has a mixture of real-world elements and fantasy elements. So if you want to work in that genre, that's perfectly fine. You just got to make sure that you are inventing some form of fictional characterization and otherworldly elements. I would not try to world build completely. Like, don't try to pull a whole Lord of the Rings in a 10 to 15 page short story, but you can incorporate otherworldly elements into your short story, much like the fairy handbag does. Alright, as far as horror, this is a genre of speculative fiction which is intended to frighten, scare, or disgust. So it contains a monster that fits one of the three monster categories, or it can be a combination. So that would be human morality monster, deadly sins monster, or abstract monster. So if you are going to do a horror story, you must have some form of monster in it. And your protagonist can even be the monster. Your protagonist can become the monster because of other elements that are happening in the story. You can really work this in multiple different ways. Once again, you can also do the science technology genre, which is just going to be some kind of scientific invention that either has a positive or possibly negative impact, much like we saw in Time Locker or in Mika models. They have some kind of scientific invention, and they explain how it works, and they create a plot around the positive or negative elements of that invention. Every one of these stories must contain literary lens content, so that means that your story has a deeper meaning that can be explained through some form of literary lens, and there must be an evidence at least of 2. Foreshadowing contents, I need to be able to see that you allow your audience to start making predictions about what's going to happen in the story. So there should be evidence of 4 of the 6 foreshadowing signposts. So either through dialogue, your characters have discussions that allow your audience to make predictions. Alrighty, so that is all for the directions. Let's take a look at the rubric real quick. So once again, the slides are 25 points. The creative short story is 20, which is a total of 45 points. When the slides itself is broken apart, The project directions, which is what I just went over, is worth a total of 8